Good morning. Today we'll be listening to Dr. Tash Tikekara, a conservationist who is working especially in the Mudumalai, Bandipur, and other neighboring forest areas, especially on the most important challenge, that is people and wildlife related issues. Within that, he's also working on the weed, that is Lantana camara, an invasive species which has occupied most of the forests now in India and causing lots of inconvenience for the wild animals as well as the local biodiversity is also lost in the process. Apart from that, he's also working on the elephants conservation, and they have developed some very good tracking software also, which can be used for other wildlife too. And I'm very happy and welcome you, Dr. Tash Tikekara. And I would like you to introduce yourself a little bit more on your work and other details, and then continue your presentation. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Dr. Sai. My name is Tash Tikekra. As Dr. Sai mentioned, I work on kind of elephant-human interactions and lantana. We started an organization called the Shola Trust about 10, 12 years ago. Uh, and these are two of the kind of key problems for conservation that are seen from a kind of grounded local perspective. And they're two key issues that need some kind of interventions, and that's how our interest in this grew. Primarily, our work now is more research than anything else because I feel like many other things in conservation, we don't really know enough about it to decide what we should do. So we actually started from much more of an activist practitioner perspective, but then we took a step back and said there's a lot of kind of knowledge gaps which we need to fill before we can plan how we're going to address these two problems. I'm currently we're also working on kind of larger issues around elephants, trying to develop genetic methods to identify individuals. But I'll talk about that more in the presentation as we go along. So I'm going to quite briefly run through both presentations that summarize our work. Let me just share screen here. So I'll start with elephants and more understanding human-elephant interactions, as it says. So the context of this area first, Gudlur is a human-dominated landscape, tea and coffee plantations largely, almost surrounded by more intact forests. So this normal idea that we'll build fences and trenches to kind of separate out wildlife spaces and human spaces doesn't really work because elephants are highly intelligent animals. And as you can see in this video, this is OVT7, Ali Baba Bashir. He's learned he can break fences with his tusks because they're not conductors of electricity. And you see, he's very careful also how he steps over the wires without getting any shock himself. Right? So they're highly intelligent animals that are able to breach any barrier. This is a supposedly elephant-proof trench, but in high rainfall areas, it fills up quite easily with mud. And after 1 year, elephants are able to go inside, in and out. And again, you think they're very big, kind of huge animals, and they are, but they're also very agile in terms of how they can move and climb and navigate slopes. So you see, it's managed to cross the trench quite easily. Um, the key point also is that in some areas there is a very hard boundary between what is society and what is nature, where human kind of use starts and where natural landscape starts. On top is, for example, a satellite image of Bandipur. But if you come down to the image, that's a satellite image of Gudlur, and you see there's no boundary visible actually. The northeast corner is Mudumalai in that map, but it kind of seamlessly moves from Mudumalai into Gudlur, and you can't make out where is habitation. Around the Gudlur town, you can see houses, but otherwise, it's a very green kind of mosaic landscape. A lot of patches of forests and kind of nature and wildlife is completely mixed in with human society. So you can't create these boundaries here. And from a kind of satellite image, if you look, it shows some crude classification, shows most of Gudlur as natural forests, but that's not the case. Actually, satellite images are not able to pick up tea and coffee easily, so it's not coming through, but it's majority tea and coffee plantations. Um, if you look at the actual forest cover in dark green and overlay that with what the forest department controls, you see there's a huge mismatch. Right? Only small areas are controlled by the forest department, and large areas are forests but owned privately by people. So this is quite a complex thing to manage. Most people don't have clear title for their land, and there's huge kind of fights over patta and people getting access to land. So this contested land is a very very important problem. There's a constant state of fight between the government and forest department and local people. It's much harder to manage the actual elephant problem or the human elephant interactions among this. As you can see, there are some images from here. Local people burnt down a jeep after a tiger killed some people, and uh, for STF, special task forces deployed in large numbers to control protests, all of that. Kumki elephants come. So it's in what's considered a high conflict area. But the key is that the conflict is not necessarily between always animals and people, it's between different groups of people. This is a key concept that should be noted. The conflict is invariably between people, not so much between animals and people. So the first thing we looked at was to try to overlay human distribution. These are all the houses in the area with elephant distribution. The green is where elephants never come, and the red is where elephants come all through the year. And the yellow is where they come sometime, to see if there's some kind of overlap. And you can see there is some in areas where there's lots of people. There are no elephants, but there are also lots of areas where there are a lot of people and a lot of elephants. Elephant presence all through the year. So we assume that these pockets where this is mixed, there'll be some few pockets where there's elephants and a lot of people, which we can kind of call conflict hotspots. But that's not the case. The majority of the region has both people and elephants mixed all through. And if you overlay to forest also, it adds another layer. I won't go into that. A key thing is also that the distribution of elephants is increasing. This is something that is not often acknowledged, but numbers are a little more complicated to talk about because we don't have robust methods of counting elephants. But what is very clear is that elephants are expanding their range. So elephants are coming into areas where they have not been before. Over a 5-year period, you can see the change in distribution of elephants. From red is where they always were in 2013 to in 2018, they are always in much more of the landscape. So a key factor in understanding how people and elephants can live together is human diversity and culture. I won't talk about this too much, but quickly just go through this. So all kind of most of the work on say human wildlife conflict assumes that all the people are the same and conflicting with elephants or having problems with elephants in the same way, but that's not true at all. There are indigenous groups like say Panyas or traditionally hunter gatherers, Katnaikins. They are very forest based, live very closely with nature. There are Betakurumbas. They are also all the mahouts for the tame elephants are kind of Betakurumbas. These are three hunter-gatherer groups. So they don't grow any agriculture and they traditionally have no conflict with animals. Their lifestyles are designed such that they don't have any conflict with animals. Then there are indigenous people who are settled agriculturalists, Mulukurumbas and the Chettis. Right? They grow rice and things like that, paddy. But they've always been doing this and they've always been interacting with elephants. So they have a long history of uh, dealing with elephants and knowing how to manage that interface. And then you have kind of immigrants into the area, people who have moved in more recently. And though they are smaller in number, they're relatively often more powerful and they control the local politics in terms of panchayats and all of that. So the narrative that you hear about conflict is not necessarily the majority narrative. It may be that the majority people don't have as much problem with elephants, but people who come in recently who don't have a history of living with elephants and who grow crops like bananas and things who elephants also like to eat, they have the maximum problems. Then you also have Sri Lankan Tamilian repatriates who moved in from Sri Lanka, who they don't grow any crops themselves and they work on tea plantations. But they have no history of interacting with elephants and they also have a lot of trouble in dealing with them. And then you have, in a sense, local elites who own these estates. They have big bungalows. They've been here around 100 odd years. And they also, I think, get along quite well with elephants. There's no particular issue. Elephants are not a threat to them. Elephants don't eat tea and coffee, so there's no damage to the economy or to themselves. And and they get along very well. So overall, this default state of human-wildlife conflict is not true actually in most places. If you dig deeper and try to break it up according to different ethnic communities or people's histories, you'll find that conflict may be limited to only some sections of society, and then you can deal with it very differently from trying to think that from thinking that all people and animals are in a constant state of conflict. And all of them have varying levels of tolerance. This is a study that was published as a book chapter as well. I can reference it later. Um, so some communities are highly tolerant of animals and some communities are less tolerant. This is based on a questionnaire survey of what people think is normal. I can read more about it if anyone's interested. The next main component was understanding the elephants better, and this is a project that we started in 2015. I won't go through too much of this. I'll just briefly let you look at the objectives. So we started with what was called an SMS early warning system based on a very successful model in Valparai, further south in Tamil Nadu. It was working very well. People got SMS warnings about elephant presence and they were moving away and avoiding elephants, and it was working very well to reduce the number of casualties. So we thought we'll do the same thing here. We automated that same system. So we kind of had an SMS long code. That number is not really a mobile number, it's a long code. And ELE was a thing that we bought, word, code word, what's it called, a short key or something. And any numbers, any messages sent with ELE to that number would get pushed to our server. All those places were mapped, and it would then automatically send a warning message to any registered users within 2 kilometers of these places. Devala, Torpalli, Kuputatti, garbage dump, all that. And the place names are also going in Malayalam and Tamil, so that even if people couldn't read English, at least they would know that that place there are elephants. So yeah, we started this, and we were starting to get elephant presence every day. People reporting where elephants were, primarily forest department field staff. But what happened is that whenever people reported there were elephants, unlike Valparai, when people used to move away, here they used to go in large numbers to see the elephants. So it had the opposite effect. Rather than reducing kind of conflict and risk, it almost was putting in people and elephants into contact more. So we stopped the warning component of messages going out, but we kept the component of collecting presence about elephants. That is moved into an app, as Dr. Sai mentioned. I can talk more about that later. Yeah, that's the app. So the key is that when we saw elephants, we wanted people to identify individuals. Much like people are all different, our hypothesis was that elephants are all different, and we want to understand the difference. How are elephants different from each other, and how they interact with people. So elephants, the key feature in identifying them is the ears. There's a lot written about this. If anybody wants, I can share more material if you get in touch with me. And we started working with forest department field staff. So whenever they see elephants, also identify the individuals. Just as a quick example, for males, it's quite easy. You can see these are 4 males. One is a tuskless male, a Makana, much older. As they grow older, you see the ear on top folds. Higher ear fold normally means older. And the shape of the tusks are very different, very easy to identify. These are 4 different males. But with females, it's a lot more complicated. The top two elephants are the same, Rani. You'll see a very distinct tear in the ear, which makes it easy to identify. But the bottom two, uh, everything is almost same. The shape of the ear, the fold of the ear, all of that. But they are not the same elephant. They are kind of sisters or something, maybe the same herd. The only difference is the back of one elephant has a slight bump at the end, and the other one is smooth. So just by quickly seeing elephants, it's hard to identify individuals. We started taking photographs and making these profiles of elephants from all sides, um, to put them together like this. And then anytime you got a photograph, you could reference against this to double check exactly which elephant it was. We also made these posters showing all the different elephants in each of the range. So yeah, it started primarily by in 2015 we had the crowdsourced monitoring and early warning system CMUs, um, that brought in a lot of sightings, which we stopped later. But basically, it started by only us doing the work, but slowly over time we have shifting that to forest department field staff taking over. This is the number of elephants. I won't go into the detail, but basically to count elephants in these fragmented landscapes is very complicated. There are no proper methods to do it. So just by how many individuals you keep seeing, we're able to get some sense of which elephant, how many times you're seeing each elephant and things like that. So yeah, this is the total number of elephants. Around 140 elephants using this landscape. The key at the outset is these elephants are quite different in that you see things like elephants sleeping. Even biologists who are studying elephants in forests for many years very rarely get to see elephants in the forest or in intact habitat sleeping, because They're generally a bit wary of people and they won't lie down and sleep unless it's totally undisturbed. But here you see them quite easily sleeping in many times of the day. So overall, this behavior of elephants are quite different. This is the elephant getting up also, just in case anyone is worried that he's looking like he was not moving for too long. This is Ganeshan. So yeah, sleep is something you see. Another key difference is that the demography in most forests, say intact forests like Mudumalai, Nagarhole, and other parks in South India, the male to female ratio is about 1:4. That is, for one male, there are almost four females. But in the Gudlur landscape, it's 1:0.7. So actually, there are more males than females. So something is going on in terms of young males moving into the landscape. The other thing is that the demography, the area moved by the elephants is also very small. Generally, it's assumed that elephants move over 1,000 square kilometers. But two elephants that we saw almost every week, so we're sure they were here all through the year, they didn't migrate anywhere else. They use very small areas, 53 square kilometers for the male and 30 square kilometers for the female. And that too, there's not 30 or 50 square kilometers of forest, right? Only the green fragments you see are forests. All the rest are like houses, tea factories, government offices, hospitals, churches, schools, temples, mosques, everything. It's a very semi-urban landscape almost, plantations. And in the middle of that, elephants are also able to survive, which is quite incredible. Um, we then categorize elephant behavior. I won't go into the table, but basically on a gradient of human presence, land-use modification, the reaction of the elephant, and the overall behavior of the elephant, we classified elephant behavioral types. So elephants, how often they were seen, things like that. I'll go through the videos now, which makes it a little clearer. First is transient elephants that we don't really see very often in the year. That's elephants that we see less than 5 times in the year. So they're not really resident here, they're moving through. We only get them in like this in the night in camera traps, right? People will say elephants came, we don't get to see them. When we go there, we put up camera traps or something, then you see one elephant has come in the night, right? The next is elephants that come regularly, but they don't come near human habitation at all. So this is, the red is kind of highly modified areas like garbage dump, highways, all that. The green is less modified areas, natural vegetation, slightly away from human habitation, more than 500 meters away from human habitation. So these elephants you can see like this. You see them on a hill slope and things like that, but they don't come near houses at all, or don't come near houses much. They never see near houses. And it's also an example of like a good, you get these relatively cheap high zoom cameras. They're about 15,000 rupees, but you can literally stand on one hill and zoom into an elephant on the other hill. So with the naked eye, if you look at the elephant, you can't see it or identify which elephant it is. These cameras play a vital role in being able to identify elephants which are very far away. The third is how they react to people. Now what we assume is that if an elephant or any mammal comes across some threat, it will exhibit the physiological response of fight or flight. It will either kind of attack the people or run away. That's the normal kind of expected thing. Uh, and you can see some elephants coming here. You can see the elephants are highly agitated, right? They're coming into very urban areas by choice, but they're not comfortable there. They are kind of moving away quickly. This is another elephant moving through a tea landscape. I don't know if the sound is visible, but there's sound here. People start making some noise and then it starts running away almost. So this is the flight response, but equally so, this is the fight response. Somebody makes noise and it charges straight at people. Right? So people often say some elephants attack, some are running away, but actually these are in our perception the same response. It's not very different. It's the same fight or flight response. And finally, elephants that are highly habituated, they don't show this response. No matter what people do, they don't get worked up. This is one example of that. For example, is moving towards a village and people are trying to chase crackers, and forest department using crackers and to keep it away, not let it come into the village, right? But it's not bothered. They're throwing firecrackers, bursting almost under its trunk, but still it just keeps moving. It's a highly habituated means. This is the same area, Torpalli, where you saw earlier one elephant quite agitated. This is another elephant, not at all agitated. You see. This is main national highway. Trucks and vehicles and all are coming. It's the RTO checkpost actually, it's crossing. Uh, Not at all afraid of people. So finally, when you kind of classify all the elephants into groups, we find that close to 86% of the elephants are not interacting with people actually. It's only barely 14% that are interacting with people and causing all the negative damage. And the negative damage is huge. I haven't mentioned it earlier, I think, but about 10, 12 people were getting killed every year in just this one division by elephants. So it was very significant. Even if crop was not damaged, people were getting killed quite a lot. And from that 14%, also around 8% were these highly habituated individuals that didn't attack people or do anything. It was only these few elephants, 6%, which was basically seven young males, that were causing all the trouble. So actually, from a mitigation of conflict perspective, you only have to worry about these seven male elephants. Um, and yeah, elephant personality also changes over time. This is the key thing. They get habituated. This is the same highly habituated elephant which was earlier quite scared of people and moving away. By 2017, that's 2008 to 2017, you see a huge difference in behavior. Very relaxed, and people are shouting inside the house, all that. It's moving around without getting agitated. And if you see, yeah, it's also people are very fond of elephants, even locally, even though they all suffer from elephants. Wherever the elephants go, there'll be a fan following of people standing and watching. See, whole fan following going like a celebrity, wherever he goes, there'll be fans following him. And this is another elephant again. I will skip that. So basically, I'm finding just based on Facebook and online kind of virtual space, every landscape has these highly habituated individuals. This is one individual in Munnar, for example. He was called Padayappa. There was Madhukare Maharaj, Rowdy Ranga, Kallur Kombe, and all these elephants. Now the issue is that very often when there's conflict, the people call for elephant to be captured, and they capture these highly habituated elephants. But this not may not be useful because these highly habituated elephants are not the ones creating trouble actually. It's more other elephants that are more shy and you don't see them that much. You don't get photos of them. Public doesn't know about them so much. Those are the ones that are doing the damage. So conclusions is baseline information, right? In terms of how you mitigate elephants. If it's a plantation landscape, it's very different from a rice paddy or ragi kind of growing farmers. Uh, how much the elephants and people are distributed and kind of how much they are overlaid onto each other is a vital first step to understand the situation before you can plan any kind of mitigation measures and what you can do. The diversity in people is a key factor that's often overlooked. There is very high tolerance levels among many communities. And we should not ignore that and just keep on saying there's conflict, there's conflict. Right? This tolerance allows or hinders coexistence. We should recognize that very clearly. And diversity in elephant behavior is also important. The forest department in chasing 80% of the time was spent chasing some 5 or 8 highly habituated elephants, and there's nothing gained by chasing them. You chase them today night, the whole day you chase them, in the night they'll come back, tomorrow morning they'll be back there. So in Gulu, the policy shifted from chasing all elephants to only monitoring all elephants, these highly habituated ones, with 2 or 3 people instead of 10 20 whole staff being there. 2 or 3 staff would monitor the elephant and more warn people if it came close. And attention was if these other elephants, these brash youngsters you're calling them, they came in, they would be moved out, they would be chased away. And that had a significant impact in reducing the number of human deaths. It fell from about 12 a year to about 5 to 3 a year, 3 to 5 a year in subsequent years. Um, and finally, I think there's a huge move everywhere to say that there are various tools and we can use software and we can use early warning systems, deterrent, lights, all that. But all these elephants are very intelligent. The only thing that can kind of actually work against the elephant is as intelligent human being who's constantly innovating as the elephant innovates. They learn whatever tools you use them. You cannot deter elephants in any way. Whatever you do, they learn. Then you have to innovate. And then they'll innovate. Then you'll innovate. It's a relationship that you have to keep alive. Tools can only help us do that. Tools are not the solution. Tools can help human beings kind of be more systematic, and that's all it is. People often get mistaken into thinking that tools are a solution. They're not the solution. That's it on the elephant front. Thanks.
Yeah, I would like to add a few things here.
Sure.
So I have when we were doing the Eastern Ghats expedition, we came across a particular situation where the state government forest officials of one state are shooing away the elephants, telling that these are the elephants from the other state. So
Yeah.
officially, they were using the crackers or the making sound and all that, and trying to making them move away. Actually,
Mm.
in the whole thing that you studied, what is important is the territoriality that gets established, or the traditional knowledge that they have, that from their own prides or groups that they learn, and especially the local biodiversity and the kind of environment that they have, and most important, you said the behavior of the elephants.
Mm.
All these things will define their existence, actually, their
Yeah.
survival and existence.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this kind of attitude of the people not understanding their nature, as you have brought up very nicely, all the dimensions around the environment's existence, the elephant's existence and the environment, and also the man-animal conflict that otherwise misunderstood, that clearly shows from your data and the research and analysis. So, how do we address? Do we need to give Aadhaar cards to elephants to say that you belong?
Uh, so that's in a sense our next step. We are trying to identify elephants based on both morphology and DNA. So the thing is, very often in high conflict areas, you will not actually be able to see the elephant. In Gullur, you can see, but even a landscape like Coimbatore, elephants only come in the night and they return back. But you'll always see dung. Elephants drop dung every hour almost. So every 3 to 4 hours. So you'll definitely get dung if they're there one night also. From the dung, you can take a swab and identify using genetics. We hope to do that. But the point is, like the Aadhaar card, it's not the Aadhaar card that's issued. So what the data in the Aadhaar card is used for, that is the complication. So I don't believe we can ever restrict elephants and say you belong to Tamil Nadu, you belong to Karnataka, you should not come to Andhra. It's not only Andhra. So Andhra migration started in the 1980s. One herd in the 1980s moved from Hosur into Andhra and colonized Chittoor district. Now it's more and more going slowly, and it's causing more and more conflict between Andhra and Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Even in Goa, it's happening. Elephants moved from Goa, Karnataka up into Maharashtra, and there also they said we chase it back. These are Kandiga elephants, not ours. Eastern Madhya Pradesh. There also elephants have moved in from Odisha. They don't want it. They're trying to push it back, but they've gone all the way and recolonized some parks now uh, in in Madhya Pradesh. So elephants will move. There is no stopping them. You cannot stop them. No, even if you want to, no matter what you do, unless you build a huge concrete wall like the Americans want to do on the south, it's not going to work. Like it's not going to work in America. It's not going to work here. So there's nothing you can do. You can use it to monitor and better understand to prevent negative interactions. The key is that elephants themselves are not problems. Negative interactions are the problem. We have to see how we minimize that. And for that, all data is useful. Something like this hopefully will work out. Let's see.
Yeah.
We are
Coming
still in
down,
early days.
good, very good analogy and of the situation of elephants. We cannot consider them like any other citizen. The whole forest belong to them, and you rightly said the kind of plantations going on, or the interference of human encroachments or deforestation. There are several other issues which are around
Yes.
their existence.
Mm.
So coming down to the one of the fundamental things where you have done lots of research, that is Lantana camara, this particular
Yeah.
species,
Mm.
because the elephants create the forest pathways too, and this
Mm.
particular species is interfering their pathways also. And
Yeah.
where other animals which are dependent on the elephant's existence for their
Mm.
own survival and their movement and all that, they are also getting affected. So you could first comment on this particular relationship between elephant and this species, how it is affecting their lives. And
Yeah.
again, secondly, you could say what this Lantana camara exotic species, I mean to say invasive species, how it is affecting the whole forest ecosystem.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, basically, anecdotally, people for a long time have been saying that the reason elephants are coming out more from kind of intact forests is because lantana is taking over. Lantana is something that they can't eat. I'll go into that in more detail later. But so they're saying lantana is pushing elephants out almost because it's occupying the forests. There have been no rigorous studies to prove this, and it's very hard to prove it actually. But I would definitely say there's some truth in it. Like 30-40% of the forest is being taken over by lantana. That means 30-40% less. It's almost as good as 30% of the forest has been uh, taken away, encroached by something, or diverted for some other purpose. So that means that many animals who are living there have to move out somewhere else. And with other smaller animals, maybe you don't see where they are, but elephants are very large, long-lived, and they'll come out and you'll see them if they come out. So there is definitely a link, though we didn't start with any link. There were slightly different problems we started when we started 10, 12 years ago. More and more, the link between the two is coming out. So it's not just elephants. Basically, elephants themselves also are not able to make a path through Lantana. Lantana completely takes over the forests. Anyway, I'll start with that presentation now. Just share my screen. Yeah, so this is an overview of our work on Lantana. I hope it will be quite brief because it's always you get too caught up in things that you feel passionately about. So first, I'll just go over the plant. I don't know how much people know about it, but it has some allelopathic properties, which means it puts out some chemicals that suppresses the growth of all other plants. So as it takes over, it actively kind of suppresses other plants. It's not just by virtue of controlling space; it stops the growth. If you cut it, it coppices vigorously. So if you cut a plant at the bottom, the new shoots will grow 6 times faster than the mother plant. So something that took 6 years to grow to some height, if you cut it in 1 year, it will come back to the same height with not just one shoot, with multiple shoots. So it doesn't work. It has a very vibrant seed bank, and it propagates vegetatively. So if you disturb the soil when you're uprooting it, all the seeds will sprout, and they'll all kind of create lots of new seedlings underneath. And if you leave a branch on the ground also, it will grow. So it's very hard to remove it. It has a very strong root system, and even after moderate fires, it is able to come back. And this is the key point: the leaves and stems contain a toxin, uh, which make it inedible for all herbivores. So it can't be eaten by any native animals. There's some debate. Some people say they've seen something eating one leaf and this that. It's true. The fresh leaves, I feel, I've not seen a paper about this, but I sense that the fresh leaves have less of this toxin, and so you see some animals browsing on the fresh leaves. But there's no doubt, if you try to make animals eat this only, they'll all die. Experiments have been done with sheep to show this. So it also has an effect on people that all plantation owners have to spend a lot of money keeping lantana off their land. So our work started, as I said, more from an activist perspective. We started making furniture with local communities. It's the chief secretary of Tamil Nadu who bought the first piece in 2009. Um, but then we felt we don't know enough about it. Is it an old problem? Is it recently started? That kind of thing. So we first plotted the history of that plant. The key thing we found is that it was first introduced to the area in 1829. The first instance of the plant in Nilgiris. 1807 it was introduced in Calcutta, we know from British records. 1829 is the first record in the south of India. Then for almost till the end of the 1800s, there's no problem. But then very quickly people start complaining, oh, it's taking over forests, it's suppressing native vegetation. And you can see there's a very quick gradient. But the key takeaway from this is that management, where they tried to stop it, started almost 100 years ago. In that sense, it's not a new problem. 1906, 1916, 1906 was first noticed. 1916, there was a management plan created to eradicate lantana from Coorg and Mudumalai, two areas here in South India only. So it's not a new problem. So we don't have to think it's not practical. It's a 100-year-old problem. We're not going to solve the problem in 5 years, 10 years. We have to solve the problem the same time scale of the problem evolved. So we have to have a 50-year, 100-year outlook in terms of what we're going to do about it. And this is the paper. If anybody's interested, it's a nice, very old paper. The next thing we did was mapping. I won't go into the methodology, but there are videos you can maybe link to that on how we did it. But we basically felt you had to first know how much lantana was there in the forest. And you can't use things like remote sensing easily because remote sensing will not capture anything that's under canopy. And lantana was also growing in under canopy, we knew that. So we used a very practical, grounded approach. We did a 1 square kilometer grid and we walked everywhere. And we mapped this and we found that the extent is huge actually. If you say Mudumalai, it's around 40% of the park is just lantana. Bandipur and Wayanad and Satyamangalam, even Wayanad we've done now, not including the map. It's a bit old. It's close to 30%, 30 to 40%. So that means like vast areas of these parks are just taken over by lantana. Right, Mudumalai, for example, is 15,000 hectares. Bandipur, at 30% of that is something like 35, 40,000 hectares is taken over. And this is the comparison of how much is lantana free. Like, even though 30% is taken over, only 10% of each park is absolutely free of lantana. That's a key kind of takeaway. And there's a new study published by Ninad Mungi and Dr. Jala and others at Wildlife Institute of India. And they've studied this across the country based on presence absence data from all of their tiger reserves. And their thing is significant. It's over 3 lakh square kilometers is taken over by Lantana, right? And to put that in perspective, tiger reserves are only 75,000 square kilometers or so. So it's 4 times the total area of tiger reserves in the whole country is just taken over by Lantana. And the total cost of removal is 5.5 billion US dollars or 40,000 crore rupees, which is 10 times more of MOEFCC's budget. Their number is a bit low also because I think wages may be lower in South India, in North India. If you do it manually in South India, 50,000 rupees a hectare is what the forest department spends for this area. Talking about 75,000 crores to remove lantana from across the country. So it's more than 10 times MOE's budget. So it's not possible to use the method we've been using to remove lantana by cutting. Like the forest departments, they remove 20 hectares, 30 hectares. Now they're trying to remove 100 hectares, which is a huge amount of money. Mudumala is spending maybe 1 crore to remove, say, 200 hectares. But 200 hectares and 15,000 hectares is still one order of magnitude difference. So there's no point doing this kind of work. You should be more focused on areas that they want to remove for particular purposes. So furniture is what people keep thinking, and we've been advocating this greatly because primarily what we need to do is shift it from forest department spending a huge amount of money to remove lantana to create livelihood for local communities who will remove it themselves. So if communities go on going and cutting lantana themselves, they'll remove it and create a livelihood, and the forest will be cleared of a weed. And department and NGOs can spend money in restoring. After you remove it, you have to restore also. You can't just remove it and leave it. It'll only lantana only will come back. We've also started making these sculptures, which is doing really well out of Lantana. We're going on exhibitions around the world. It's a multi-institution collaboration where we'll be doing this. You can see more about it. But what we need is more large-scale approaches that use the lantana at scale. For furniture, only some sticks you cut and remove. So we have a shredder, for example, to powder this. There's a video available of that also. And we're looking at making briquettes or possibly even charcoal and a whole lot of other things to create a whole industry around using lantana. We feel that is the only future. This is a pulverizer. I won't go through it now. You can even modify maybe this mini thing behind tractors to see if you can have some small scale community owned efforts to remove it. Uh, yeah, so basically what we need is at least in a trial phase. Currently, the policy is not clear on whether tribals can remove lantana or not. So we need some small scale plots that forest department give to tribals to allow them to remove to see if the economics work out. Does it work out for them? It may have to be subsidized in the beginning by forest department also, but to closely study the economics at scale. Back of the envelope calculations seem to work because every hectare you should get about 30 tons of lantana. Um, at even 1 rupee a kilo, which is quite low for the biomass, that's 30,000 rupees, which should work out. It's very hard to carry the plant and move it, and transport will be expensive to move it out from forest, so that adds quite a bit of cost. But if you make briquettes and we sell at say 4 rupees, 5 rupees a kilo, there's definitely scope for this to be a self-sustaining process. But we have to look at the economics at scale, not in a trial sort of small plots. But at least 5 hectares is quite big plots for tribals to start to move it. And technology is a very complex thing. See, very often um, there's it's very hard to use any big machines because they damage everything. Like if you use JCBs to remove lanterns from the forest, it scrapes the forest floor of all the plants and kills everything. So regeneration is very poor. Everything is very poor. It plows up the soil almost, and then lantern itself comes back. So you can't use heavy machines. So we've been advocating manual all these years, but we are increasingly finding that people don't want to do this grudging, backbreaking hard work anymore. It's very hard to find people in some areas, particularly around Wayanad and say Mudumalai also, uh, who will actually do this work. And it's also labor is very expensive rates, which is a good thing for local communities. They get a better livelihood, but at least 500 rupees a day you have to pay minimum for a person here. So it becomes very expensive to remove lantana. So some minimal technological interventions will be needed, but appropriate small scale technology that can be controlled and used by local communities, not vast industrial scale kind of things that do a lot of ecological damage. And yeah, we have to create a whole industry around it. If anybody has ideas, it will be great to get started and collaborate. We're making furniture already, some sculptures. We're looking at particle boards, fuel woods, charcoal, everything. And we're looking to people to collaborate to kind of take this forward. We have to actually collaborate with market players who are going to take this to market, not just make it in experimental setups. Like particle boards have been made, papers have been published, brackets have been made, papers have been published. We know we can do this. It's like that link to the market needs a lot of practical kind of market knowledge and experience in the industry. And it'll be great if people like that get involved so that we can move this forward. Thank you.
Yeah, great, Trash. Your presentation was very good,
Thank you.
and it brought most important two perspectives: the vegetation as well as the animal like elephant. Two aspects in the conservation of Eastern Ghats. And apart from this, for the conservation of Eastern Ghats as a covering all the 5 states which stretches across, what could be the kind of initiatives that we need to take up now so that it becomes a policy aspect for the conservation? Any suggestions that you could say?
I mean, yeah, it's not directly linked to my uh, work, but I feel one key thing that we are going badly wrong is that we've got a wrong perception of forest fire. Forest fire is something that Indians have been doing for 50,000 years. They have been burning the landscape. There's a very nice review published by Stephen Pine who talks about fire as the circle of life. So it kind of destroys, but it creates a new room for rebirth and regeneration. And we generally feel that trees are destroyed by fires, but new research is showing that South Indian trees are not destroyed by fires. Deciduous trees, or savannas as they should be called, are adapted to fires. So fires inherently open up the landscape. They promote grasses over trees, which is what is needed. At the moment, what people do is they remove lantana and try to plant trees, but that's inherently problematic. A shrub will almost always outcompete a tree. What we need is a shrub to be outcompeted by a grass, and then the grass can slowly allow for succession for trees to come back. And fire is a key tool for this. It's a kind of colonial mindset that we are stuck with. And the thing is that because of our mismanagement of fire for the last 20, 30 years, we're having devastating fires now that's killing trees and kind of completely ruining the landscape. Otherwise, indigenous people have very sophisticated knowledge of how you should burn, when you should burn. Like you should not burn in peak summer. So a paper published some years ago, for example, that studied the conditions under which fires are devastating and very huge. You need very high wind speed, you need very low humidity, you need a very high temperature, and you need huge amount of fuel wood load or biomass load, dead biomass, right? So it's almost every year when these conditions all come together, somewhere one spark will start a wildfire, right? The only thing from these four factors that we can control is the dead biomass. We can burn and remove the dead biomass ourselves when the other factors are not favorable for large fires. Then you'll have only ground fires that sweep underneath, clear off the fuel wood, and it will promote grasses, it will reduce lantana, it will create more fodder for animals. It will altogether, I feel, be very beneficial, but we've lost the knowledge of how to burn. And if you burn lantana, it's too much biomass, it will kill everything, it will kill the trees, everything. So you have to remove lantana, burn and restore. I think this burning cycles have to come back into India. It's a key issue. It's not just lantana, there are hundreds of invasive species that are taking over because there's been a kind of paradigm shift in the way the forests are managed. From fire to no fire is a huge change from an ecological perspective, and that's allowing lots of species to come in and changing the dynamic of how the forests are. We published a paper in EPW about this, multiple scientists, and kind of bringing together indigenous knowledge, history, ecological knowledge, arguing that we have to bring back fire. I think that's the key thing. The problem is we've lost the knowledge of how we should burn. So we have to first recreate that knowledge and do experiments to understand how to burn, and then we have to restart burning. So I hope that perspective will change. Let's see.
Yeah, good to listen to this perspective about the fires and the forest. And you are true that especially how it recycles or improves the soil as well as regenerates, because for every forest there is a life actually. So again, here it has to regenerate, and there are different phases of forest ecosystems. Even as carbon sequestration, we need to understand that balance actually. And myself coming with that background of fire and biochar and all that, definitely the biochar that is developed in the forest area due to forest also adds a lot, as well as the ash. And also it is a very good thing for the soil improvement where there is high
Completely.
leachates are there, how to
Yes.
hold these nutrients and all that. And I remember, yes, having come to the Shola Trust and met you all regarding the chullas, especially
Yes.
fish and chullas, and how we could use this lantana camara and various other biomass, wasted biomass or unwanted biomass for this cook stoves, improved cook stoves. And I think there are so many initiatives taken by the Shola Trust, and very good work is going on there. And we ourselves coming, myself representing the Council for Green Revolution and the Greens Alliance for Conservation of Eastern Ghats. Definitely, we will work together in the future. And I would like to thank from the Earth Leaders channel today that we could transmit live our discussion. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Dr. Sai.
Yeah, I would like to see in the future we'll have more such sessions, and so
Sure,
that
sure. That would be great.
many others. Thank you very much for your
Thank
valuable
you.
time. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.